Today's lecture is going to be on the Russian Revolution, but it's also going to include information from the century kind of leading up to the Russian Revolution. I'm going to go over some things that we've been talking about with Russia in class from like the last few months, not quite going back to like the age of absolutism, but remember that Russia, generally speaking, remains much more conservative throughout the 19th century than a lot of other places in Europe, maybe aside from Austria. So I'm going to basically start at just a really brief review of talking about some things going back to Alexander the First. Now, let me go ahead and put up the I'm going to screen share, and I'm going to put up this PowerPoint here and kind of use this as I go through. But the PowerPoint, I'm kind of only loosely going off of the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint's pretty limited in terms of the information that it has on there, but we're going to do some review of things, and I'm going to talk about some ideas that I think will be very helpful for you guys in terms of better understanding not only Russian history, but the grand scheme of like Russia in comparison to the rest of Europe up through World War I, where, spoiler alert, actually Russia has to drop out of World War I in 1917 because they have a full-blown communist revolution on their hands. So let's go over to desktop view. And here's my little PowerPoint. Okay. So, generally speaking, the Russian Revolution results in a communist dictatorship that uses fear and oppression to maintain control. Not that oppression wasn't used to maintain control underneath the Tsar, because certainly the Tsarist government was really oppressive on its own, but the communists, the level of oppression under the communist rulers goes up substantially under Stalin. Not that that's a funny thing, but basically the idea behind communism, we've talked about it a bit in class before. Communism is about the opposite of capitalism and democracy, and communism is a confusing term for kids because communism can refer to both a political system, but it can also kind of refer to an economic system. So usually when we talk about our political system in the United States, we refer to it as being a democratic republic. But you know, it would be just as accurate to say of Russia that both their government and their economy are communist. We would talk about our economic system not as being democratic. That term doesn't really fit with economic systems. We would call our system capitalist. You guys know a lot about global capitalism and the effect that that has had. You know, well, the effect that the Industrial Revolution has had in terms of imperialism and stuff like that. A couple of terms just to remind you. Remember the Tsar. Tsar can be spelled either C-Z-A-R or T-S-A-R. That's basically an emperor-like figure. We've talked about Tsars a lot. Autocracy is the type of government technically that Russia has before the communist revolution happens, where basically the Tsar has complete power. It's an autocratic, absolutist type government. And then we've talked about those terms bourgeoisie and proletariat quite a bit in class. You know, the bourgeoisie being kind of the rich upper middle class and the proletariat being the lower working urban class. So a little bit about communism, government economic system where all factors of production become property of basically the entire society rather than individuals. So, you know, in a capitalist economy, you guys can participate in the economy individually. You can own businesses. You can get basically whatever job that you want, and you own land, property, You own money, you have private ownership of goods, but all of these ideas have, created in Europe kind of a large urban working population that has relatively little in terms of wage and property ownership, and then a kind of a small ruling elite class of bourgeois, upper middle class folks. The idea behind communism, as proposed by Karl Marx, like we've talked about before, is that there's that history is made up of basically class conflict. And remember, Marx, coming out of the 1840s and 50s, in that time where he saw kind of the worst of the Industrial Revolution, in terms of creating an underclass of urban workers who are really disenfranchised and stuff, and being an expert on the French Revolution, basically says, like, eventually this is going to lead to the underclass of people understanding or having a consciousness about their oppression, and then rising up in a violent revolution of sorts that de-seats the ruling upper middle class and establishes what he called a quote-unquote dictatorship of the proletariat. And under that system, everybody was supposed to be equal without any sort of social stratification or class stratification, where you have, like, a ruling class and then an underclass. He said that everybody would ideally, after a communist revolution, participate equally in the economy, in all of the means of production, whether that be, labor or purchasing power or wages or anything like that, and that everything could be kind of utopian and great. But of course, that's not the way that these communist revolutions end up panning out most of the time. It really ends up in, you have like these terribly oppressive communist dictators. The economy itself is really inefficient, and there's tons of bureaucracies, and stuff is really low quality, and it's not priced competitively, and there's shortages of goods. And so that means that people are trading things illegally, which means that you're doing it kind of under the away from the eyes of the government, because you're trading things illicitly. And communism just doesn't really end up working out very well. But of course, you guys all know Karl Marx. He was the guy that came up with all these ideas in the Communist Manifesto in 1848. We, of course, have a capitalist system, which is basically the exact opposite of communism. Not that we're 100% free trade, because we do have some government regulations on various sectors of the economy, and we do have certain socialized elements of our economy. But that being said, we allow for the private ownership of goods and private exchange of goods and services, which is the root of capitalism, as well as being able to invest in businesses that you think are going to be profitable, and the idea of entrepreneurship and stuff like that. Well, all of that goes out the window with communism. So they wanted to establish this classless society. Marx and Engels, Friedrich Engels, if you guys remember, believed that capitalist systems were basically bound to destroy themselves, because the poor, or working class, otherwise known as the proletariat, would rebel against the wealthy upper classes and form this classless society, where all factors of production, whether that be businesses or land or capital, are going to be now publicly owned. Because remember, capitalist systems are where it's privately owned. But he says that Marx and Engels suspected that once you created this classless society, everything would be publicly owned. So if you think about a public library, for instance, or a public school, why do we say public? It's because it's owned and operated by the government. The people all share in those institutions, and they're paid for with tax money and things like that. Well, in a communist society, all institutions are public. There is no private ownership of goods. So I'm going to stop there for a second. And I'm going to go back to me, and I'm going to double check to make sure that there's not any questions already. Oh dear, here we go. Communism. That's questions about my red shirt. It's a Canada shirt. Everybody loves Canada. Is this PowerPoint on Schoology? It's not on Schoology, but I'll put it on Schoology later. But does anyone have any questions so far about communism or anything along those lines? I just want to make sure that we're all crystal clear on what communism is before we jump into talking about all this stuff. So hopefully you guys are comfortable with where we're at so far. I suggest that if you're not comfortable with the differences between capitalism and communism, that you get comfortable with those things. I've done the best that I can right now to explain them. Socialism kind of falls somewhere in between. Socialism can occur in countries that are democratic. Socialism taken to the ultimate extreme, where you literally don't have any sectors of your economy that are privately owned and operated anymore, is then communism. It's basically the socialization of everything, if you will. But okay, seeing as there's, let me just refresh this really fast. Seeing as there's no questions, let's go back to it. If you do have questions, I'll get to them later. Okay, so remember going back to that idea of utopian society. Utopian societies, not to say that social utopianism was the same as communism, because social utopians a lot of times advocated for keeping in place governments and making reforms on behalf of the workers to give them a little bit better life. But you know, kind of the idea behind communism is creating ultimate classless utopian society where everybody shares in equally. Well, ultimately what really happens is that when you create that kind of system, a communist governmental and economic system, which is known as a command economy, where everything is commanded, or supply, demand, price, wage, everything is dictated by the state. It creates, like I said before, basically a system where everybody is equal, but they're equally poor, they're equally poverty stricken. And a lot of people's lives in Russia, the reason that, if you ask yourself, like, why would people want this? You know, the working class, the urban workers, keep in mind that the symbol of communism is a sickle and hammer. It looks like this. You know, this sickle here is a thing that farmers use to cut down grain, and then this is a hammer, which is of course used by urban workers. Why do they take on that symbol? They're trying to appeal to the urban working classes and rural agrarian workers, whose lives are really not very good anyway. I mean, they live in extreme poverty. They don't have very many rights. Remember how long serfdom lasts in Russia. And so the idea of a champion of the working class means that, you know, and a system that supports everybody engaging in commerce equally is a pretty lucrative idea for, or I mean, not lucrative, but a pretty appealing idea for people who are in that particular level of oppression. What they didn't realize, of course, is that communism would bring back a number of the concerns that already existed under the autocratic Tsarist government run by Nicholas II and previous Tsars to him. Really quickly talking about World War II, or World War I rather. This is the Lusitania. We haven't talked about this in class yet. We're going to get to this on Tuesday, but I'm talking about all this stuff now because I won't be able to have time in class to talk about it on Tuesday. So really quickly, Germany had been using this thing called unrestricted U-boat warfare in World War I, which we will talk about. But the idea of unrestricted U-boat warfare is that they basically didn't only attack military targets with their ships. They ended up attacking other targets. And one of the targets that they attacked was the Lusitania, which is why that's in the background there. But the United States, declared war on April 6th, 1945, 1917. And right about this exact same time in World War I, Russia was withdrawing from the war as the US was entering, because Germany failed to end the war before the US entered it. And we'll talk about what brings Russia out of the war. Not only did they have internal discontent, but basically Russia signs a document called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And this document negotiated the loss of a tremendous amount of Russian land, and basically given over to Germany in order for an agreement that they would no longer fight on the Eastern Front, which was, the war between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and who were on the same side, and Russia. So, a couple of things. This guy right here, I showed you in class before. He's the cousin of George V of England. His name is Nicholas II. But before we talk about Nicholas II, I'd like to take this moment to spend some time talking about previous Tsars of Russia. Let's go back a little ways. Remember that the Romanov dynasty, began its rule in 1613. I'm going to bring you all the way up to basically 1913 to 1923 here. So really, the Romanov dynasty, or Romanov dynasty as some people say, has been the ruling Tsarist dynasty for 300 years, when Nicholas II, who is the last member of the Romanov dynasty, is taken out of power in 1917. But let's go back. Let's talk a little bit here. Nicholas II was, the last of the Tsars. But let's go back to Tsar Alexander I. You guys might remember Tsar Alexander I. He was the guy who fought against Napoleon. He was also the guy who negotiated the Holy Alliance. If you remember the Holy Alliance after the Congress of Vienna, going back to 1815 in Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, Alexander Tsar Alexander I grew increasingly reactionary. Russian nobles opposed any liberal reforms that threatened their influence. He saw the Russian Orthodox Church as an instrument in keeping his subjects under control. He establishes that Holy Alliance after the Congress of Vienna, where he tried to kind of team up with Austria-Hungary to stop the growth of liberalism, uphold Christian principles, and really prevent revolution. So Tsar Alexander I, extremely reactionary, conservative. You might remember him. His rule, Tsar Alexander I, is from 1801 to 1825. In 1825, he dies. You might remember that little thing we talked about in class last time called the Decembrist Uprising of 1825, where there was a power struggle after his death, where his younger brother Constantine was supported by liberal nobles, but Constantine didn't want the throne. And then his younger brother Nicholas was the next in line, and he was the one that was supported by the conservatives. And the Decembrists, when we talk about the Decembrist uprising, the Decembrists were those junior military officers, that liberal upper class opponent of the autocratic Russian system of government, who supported a lot of grievances or complaints that the Russian society had. And the Decembrist uprising ends up being suppressed, violently suppressed by Nicholas I, and the Decembrist leaders were all executed. They were, those junior military officer leaders, they're all killed. So we have a new Tsar Nicholas I. Nicholas I ruled as Tsar from 1825 to 1855. So really, we've got, in the first 50 years, it's kind of easy to remember, in the first 55 years of the 19th century, from 1800 to 1855, there's two monarchs, and it's basically split right down the middle between Alexander I and his younger brother Nicholas I. Nicholas became pretty much the most reactionary conservative monarch of Europe. And he was super conservative to the point where he believed in divine right. Now remember, that idea of divine right is that God gives me the power to rule, so any decisions that I make must mean that God meant for those decisions to happen. This is a pretty old school idea in comparison to a lot of other things that are going on in Europe this time, where you see, you know, pretty moderate reforms in places like Britain and France that support, you know, capitalism and imperialism and things like that eventually down the line. So there were the principles of autocracy that we talked about before, that autocratic government, orthodoxy, nationality, become the foundation of the Russian state during Nicholas I's rule. And he wants to prevent all of these Western European ideas from penetrating Russia. He kind of wants to keep Russia its own separate entity, separate conservative, anti-liberal entity. And the revolutions of 1830 and especially the revolutions of 1848 convinced Nicholas I that suppressing liberalism was crucial to maintaining order in Russia. Russia during the reign of Nicholas I becomes basically a police state with heavy loads of censorship. There was a secret police foundation called the Third Section. State-sponsored terrorism. There was absolutely no representative body. There was no parliamentary body or anything like that. It resulted in the alienation of Russian intellectuals. At this time, though, they do smuggle a lot of Western books into Russia, but those are made illegal. They're censored. If you were found with them, you were liable to be executed. So Nicholas I believed serfdom was inefficient, but he thought that trying to change that would only stir up rebellion. So let's move forward from Nicholas I. 1855, like one of the last things that happens during Nicholas I's reign is the Crimean War of 1853. So let's just review that for a second here. Russia, as you guys might remember, were defeated in the Crimean War, which marked a turning point in Russian history by basically the first time that Russia kind of starts to foster the idea of modernizing. Remember that to this point, industrialism had not really reached Russia. It was primarily a British, Belgian, and American phenomenon, and lesser so France. But Russia realizes after the Crimean War that it has to modernize, or that it's going to basically remain vulnerable both militarily and economically. Couple of things. The Russian army in 1853 was basically, during the Crimean War, was largely composed of basically uneducated, unskilled serfs who performed really poorly on the battlefield. Also, because they haven't modernized and because they've been so oppressive of liberalism, Russia lacked a sizable middle class that promoted those types of things. And so these are kind of some key differences for why Russia lagged behind both Britain, France, and then also later Germany, because you had like a strong nobility in Russia that was not a force for modernization. Of course, the nobles are going to be, anti-reform. They're going to be conservative, right? So, you just don't really see Russia keeping up with the times until after the end of Nicholas I's reign. And that's when we have Alexander II. So Alexander II is the third Tsar of Russia, and he lasts from 1855 to about 1881. Alexander II, unlike the two Tsars before him, Alexander I and Nicholas I, was probably the most reform-minded Tsar of this time since Peter the Great. If you remember Peter the Great was, the guy that really wanted to make Russia as much like absolutist France as he could, modernize it. He made all the nobles trim their beards and stuff. You might remember Peter the Great during the Age of Absolutism unit back in first semester. But Alexander II, 1855 to 1881, he's the most liberal ruler in Russian history prior to the 20th century. But even during Alexander II's rule, Russia remains pretty much largely autocratic. He believes serfdom had slowed down Russia's modernization, and agriculture in Russia had been very poor for centuries. 90% of people during think about this for a second. I mean, this is how far Russia lagged behind, is that even during Alexander II's rule from 1855 to 1881, we're in the 19th century here. By this point, we have steamships and factories making tons and tons of goods, and we're entering into really the second industrial revolution by the time that Alexander II's rule ends in 1881, and 90% of the people in Russia still work in agriculture. So serfs could be bought or sold with or without land in the early 19th century. A lot of times serfs had previously been tied to the land, but serfs are not much better than slaves at this point. Nobles enjoyed basically an unlimited source of labor. Russia looks very much like France looks, from France from the 16 and 1700s, early 1700s, is kind of what Russia looks like in the 1800s, late 1800s. So that's Alexander II in a nutshell. The other thing about serfs is that they could be conscribed or conscripted into the army for like 25 years. So, and of course, if you get conscribed into the army because they're not very good, there's a high chance of them not surviving their service. So anyway, in 1861, there's an Emancipation Act that we talked about, and that's the thing that abolishes serfdom. Peasants were no longer dependent on the lord. They were basically free to move around and change occupations, and so on. As we move through Alexander II's reign, moving up to about the early 1880s, we see some mild reforms take place. Censorship kind of gets relaxed a bit for a while. Education is somewhat liberalized during his rule. And then industrialization starts to take place during Alexander II's, Tsar Alexander II's reign. And the thing that stimulates industrialization in Russia is the railroad construction. So they start building railroads in Russia. They were way behind the rest of Western and Central Europe, though. They needed better railroads. Russia is huge. There's two things that Russia has that serve as kind of advantages in war for Russia, by the way. And I was thinking about this earlier. I'm going to go back and check to see if we have any questions here. I'm going to say this really fast, though. There's kind of two advantages that Russia has in war, and one of them is you might call an offensive advantage, and one of them is a defensive advantage. The offensive advantage that Russia has is that they have a ton of people. There's a huge population in Russia. And so because there are so many people in Russia, they can just keep on pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring people at you. The thing is that the Russian troops are not very well trained. They're perpetually underarmed and underskilled and undereducated and all these different things. So the Russian military forces are not very good military forces, but it's kind of like being enveloped by like locusts or something. If there's just so many of them, it's like a single bee. Unless you're allergic to bees, a single bee isn't going to kill you, right? But if 1,000 bees like swarm your body, or 1 billion bees, they're probably going to have some serious issues surviving that. The Russian forces work much the same way. A singular Russian unit, may not be a particularly skilled soldier, but an entire brigade of them is going to be more difficult to stop, and then they can just keep pouring more at you. So that's one of the major advantages. The other major advantage of Russia is its size, and that's a defensive advantage, because whenever the Russians decide to withdraw into their territory, as we talked about during the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon invades Russia, which was a critical mistake of Napoleon, they just continued to withdraw into their massive territory, and ended up, using scorched earth practices, scorch and burn practices, and burn down their own territory. I mean, it sounds insane, but that's a major advantage for Russia, is just how much land there is. But having so much land meant that, and not being industrialized meant that it's also difficult for Russia. It serves as an obstacle of sorts too, because Russia then has to take and find ways to transport stuff across their land, which doesn't have a lot of infrastructure and roads or electricity or things like that. So building the railroad was a major factor in helping Russia to industrialize. So really quickly here, I'm just going to double check, make sure we don't have any major questions lingering. Yeah, Russia does basically use might over skill, I would say. And then the other question that Mariah just came up with was, when did Russia actually catch up with the advancements of technology? Answer, never. I mean, Russia even today is not, is nowhere near as advanced technologically as, like, say, most of Western Europe or the United States and Canada and Australia. They still economically lag behind. Now, industrially, Russia becomes advanced during World War II, I guess I would say, or at least much more so than they were during the latter part of the 19th century. But Russia goes through this communist period, which is what we're going to talk about the start of in today's lecture, but it lasts all the way up until 1991, when I was in like first grade. So during that period of time, the Russian economy ends up stagnating and really not growing anymore, and becoming like how would I say it, like a dying attrition type economy, where they don't grow anymore. It just flatlines. And so, you know, the Russian economy ends up, even to this day, not being as advanced as much of the rest of what we would call first, you know, developed nations or first world nations, or what you want to say. So okay, I'm gonna move now into talking a bit more about kind of catching up to where we finally get to Nicholas II here. There's only one other Tsar. So just as a quick review, Alexander I, Nicholas I, Alexander II, he takes us up to 1881, and then 1881 to 1894, Alexander III. And then finally Nicholas II. So it's all Alex and Nicholases from 1800 until the last Tsar, Nicholas II. Double check, make sure we don't have any other last minute questions. Really quickly, Adam Jackson. So essentially, Russia uses numbers and bold strategy to keep up in industrialized battles. I'd say that's a fair assessment. Yeah, I would agree with that. Also, France still has the largest population in Europe, or have they been replaced? That's a good question. My guess is they probably did still have the largest population in Europe. But certainly all of Europe has experienced a massive population boom by this point. So if we're looking at the entire population of Europe, it has gone up tremendously in the last century. And that's pretty much across the board: Britain, France, Germany, Italy. There's a huge, in even Russia, there's a huge population boom eventually. So let's go ahead and go back to the PowerPoint here. Hopefully you guys are finding this interesting. I know I am. This is good review for you guys too. And so let's keep moving forward here. Screen share, entire screen share. Okay. So really quickly, Alexander III, before we get to Nicholas II. Alexander III was, you know, continuing to rule Russia through those three terms that we've talked about before: autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationalism, or Russification, as they sometimes called it. You might remember this term zemstos. The Zemstos were actually established by Alexander II in 1864. Zemstos were districts or village assemblies that that administered kind of local areas. They're kind of predecessors, if you will, to Soviets. We'll talk about what Soviets are in just a second here. But Zemstos were actually a significant step towards popular participation in government under Alexander II's rule. But really, you know, noble lords are the ones that are controlling these Zemstos, and so you know, they still had more influence than the peasants did in these small little villages and stuff. But you know, in these Zemstos continue through Alexander III's reign, and they influenced and reduced kind of judicial power, which shifted to the police and military courts, and the Russian Orthodox Church ends up persecuting other religious groups in Russia during Alexander III's rule. And so that's basically, in a nutshell, that talks about Alexander III. Now, under Alexander III, there was a guy by the name of Count S.Y. Witte, who oversaw Russian industrialization in the 1890s, and he aggressively appeals to or courts Western capital and advanced technology to start building factories in Russia, and it resulted in kind of a small Russian middle class starting to develop during Alexander III's reign. By 1900, Russia becomes kind of fourth in steel production, but believe it or not, behind the U.S., Germany, and Britain. They start to export petroleum in the early 1900s, and as in Western Europe, industrialization in Russia contributed to the spread of kind of Marxism, because of course you now have a growing urban working population who is kind of an underclass who feels, you know, exploited. They don't get treated very well, which is characteristic of most urban working classes. So now let's move our way into Nicholas II's rule. Okay, Nicholas II comes to power in 1894, as you can see on the little slide here, and this is what we're looking at with Nicholas II. This is what he looks like in the back. And during the Nicholas II's rule, Russia is suffering some pretty serious military defeats that concern both Russian citizens and the rest of Europe. The most notable of these early on in his reign is, of course, the Russo-Japanese War, which we talked about before, where basically Russians were trying to establish a sphere of influence in Manchuria, and tried to take over some areas around Korea to build a railroad to gain access to seas, kind of the sea on the east or on the western board of Korea. Well, the Russian fleet is destroyed by the Japanese in 1904, and the Russian losses were extremely heavy on land. This results in the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was helped negotiated by Teddy Roosevelt, actually. And the Treaty of Portsmouth is where Russia accepts Japanese control of Korea and Manchuria, which I think I talked about before. Also under Nicholas II, the Russian government turned its attention away from the East, and after losing to the Japanese, because they're like, okay, well, we're not going to deal with them anymore. Let's focus on the Balkans, which is what I was trying to explain to you before. So Russia's dismal showing in the Russo-Japanese War becomes a major cause of the revolution of 1905. Now, this is where things get a little bit confusing, because there's actually two Russian revolutions, if you will. So let's move on here. The first revolution is what we might call the Revolution of 1905. And it happens when something called Bloody Sunday happens. This is January 1905. There were about 200,000 workers and peasants who were, of course, upset about being oppressed. They're marching in protest to Nicholas's rule. They're upset that Russia has lost the Russo-Japanese War. And at this time, the Tsar is not in town. And in order to maintain control over this massive demonstration of 200,000 workers marching in the middle of the town, the army, the National Guard, starts firing onto these peaceful protesters, and they end up killing anywhere between about 130 and 300 workers, and wounding an additional 1,000 people. Now let's just stop for a second here, kids, because let's go back. Let's consider this for a moment. Let's say that there was a giant strike. It was a peaceful protest. Now, the 200,000 people is a whole lot of people. That's like the entire population of the entire city of Corona. All right, but you know, could you ever imagine? Well, I guess you probably could, because actually it did happen. where we okay, so the National Guard back in this is a true story. National Guard, there was some protests at a university called Kent State University in 1970, and they were protesting the Vietnam War. Anyway, the National Guard opens fire on these protesters at this college. They kill a few college kids. It was really sad, but this was like crazy news. I mean, it's still like a huge deal. People remember Kent State as being like one of the darkest days of, you know, the American public's view of the military. But I mean, think for a moment, if like in the news today you heard about, you know, a protest about like, you know, whatever, the government or what, and then like the National Guard, the army comes in and like just opens fire on the crowd and wounds like 1,000 people and kills 300. I mean, that's like a big deal, right? So this was not something that was going to be overlooked in Russia. It was a big deal. But anyway, let's go back to the thing here. I just wanted to like take a second to address that. So here we go to the entire screen again. All right. Current slide. Okay, so this sparks countrywide protests, a general strike, peasants revolt, troops start to mutiny. If you've never heard that term mutiny before, what that means is that they stop following orders of their officers. You've got two ranks of people in most modern militaries. You've got the enlisted ranks, which are the lower ranks, and then you have the officer ranks. And when you have a mutiny, whether it's on a ship or in a brigade or whatever, what that means is you've got officers who don't have control of their troops because the troops are uprising. The enlisted men are rising up against their officers. So these mutinies start breaking out, and people are freaking out. So what happens is that before this happens, don't look down here yet. I'm going to black that out. Okay. Before so basically here's what happens. After this strike breaks out, countrywide protests, okay, force some concessions, okay? Remember, World War I hasn't yet started yet. I should black these out too, okay? World War I hasn't started yet. We're still in the year 1905 at this point. Remember, World War I doesn't start until 1914. It's important to get this timeline straight because we're kind of talking about two things at once. One of the concessions, if you guys know what that term concession is, if you go to a party and they give out concessions, that means that they give out like a little bag of knickknacks or whatever. And one of the things that they give into was this thing called the Duma. Okay, let's talk about what the Duma is. There was a thing called the October Manifesto of 1905, and this creates this Duma, D-U-M-A. The Duma is supposed to be a national assembly that's going to serve as like a representative body that advises the Tsar, and that these representatives were supposed to be elected by universal male suffrage. They were supposed to grant, you know, freedom of speech, assembly, and press. However, the Tsar retained an absolute veto power over the Duma. Okay, so this Duma is like a representative body. All right. The problem is that you have a Tsar here, Tsar Nicholas II, who rules by divine right and is a firm believer in a conservative autocratic government. And so the Duma was a great idea, but it was smoke and mirrors to try to placate or quiet or calm a group of very upset people in Russia. And so the Duma ends up actually being dissolved twice within the first year of its being implemented. And many liberals and middle-class professionals at this time are continuing to urge reform to try to give the Duma some degree of legitimacy. And so they established basically a third Duma in 1907 that is more conservative and basically goes along with whatever the Tsar wants. And if people start to get upset or hot-headed, they just use oppressive techniques to weaken political opponents, or put down any types of people who are seeking any legitimate reforms. So there's a lot of government, even though you've got now this quote unquote representative body called the Duma, there's still a lot of government sponsored violence. Jews during this time are being savagely persecuted. There's these things called pogroms where they're basically just going into these small Jewish towns and executing all the Jewish folks and taking their property and stuff. There's anywhere between like 600 to 1,000 political opponents who are executed in military courts between 1906 and 1907. And so this Duma is not the most effective representative body of all time. You start to see, of course, during this time, this rise we talked a moment ago of kind of Marxist sentiments, and this rise of socialism in Russia takes place thanks to a guy by the name of Vladimir Lenin, and we're going to talk about him in just a moment here. So let me skip forward to Vladimir Lenin. Okay, let me put this right. We'll put this right here. Okay, so Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin is a revolutionary figure in Russia. He becomes basically the heir, if you will, to Marx in socialist thought. So Vladimir Lenin basically starts a social democratic workers' party in a city called Minsk, M-I-N-S-K. And Lenin is the leader of this party. Lenin's brother was arrested and hanged for plotting to assassinate the Tsar, Nicholas II. Of course, he was unsuccessful in that. But when Vladimir Lenin's older brother is hanged, Lenin is exiled to Switzerland. Now, Switzerland remains neutral in World War I and in most wars, and they have a population of a bunch of different people speak languages, ethnic groups there. You've got like the German-speaking Swiss, and you've got the Italian-speaking Swiss and the French-speaking Swiss. Well, while he's in Switzerland, Vladimir Lenin picks up a few pamphlets on Marx, and he starts writing his own, and he takes Marx's ideas and kind of starts changing them around. Now, remember, Marx's Communist Manifesto has been around now for several decades by the time that Lenin starts reading about Marxism, and he takes Marx's ideas and he kind of puts his own twist on them. The three basic ideas that were central to Lenin's philosophy on Marxism were that, one, capitalism could be destroyed only by violent revolution. he denounced this revisionist type of Marxism that we've talked about in class before. He said that violent revolution from the proletariat rising up was the only way that capitalism could be destroyed. Whereas a lot of other Marxists during this era had previously kind of started backing off of the idea of Marxist, violent revolutions, and advocated for a more, what we talked about in class, a little bit more moderate view on revisionist Marxism. But he is not one of those people. The second major idea of Lenin is that socialist revolution or communist revolution was possible under certain conditions, even in a relatively backwards and poor Russia. So he basically said that even though Russia was really poor, and didn't have a lot of educated folks who knew a lot about Marxism, that revolution could still take place in a place like Russia. And then finally, the other major idea central to Lenin's Marxist views, or Leninist views, is that he said that there was basically, you needed to have a ruler to lead this revolution. Basically, you needed a highly disciplined party, strictly controlled by a dedicated group of intellectuals, namely him, and full-time revolutionaries, in order to get these things off the ground. So this is a major, major difference between Lenin and Marx. If you're ever asked the difference between Lenin and Marx, this is what you would want to say, is that Lenin advocated for the organization of a particular political party that would be able to lead the proletariat into a revolution in order to be successful. Now, there was a guy named Alexander Kerensky that we're going to talk about in a little bit here, but I'm going to come back to Kerensky because we're not quite there. I just wanted to introduce to you Vladimir Lenin. We'll talk more about Lenin in a little bit here. So 1903, you had this Social Democratic or Social Democratic Workers' Party that ended up splitting into two factions, and we're going to talk about what these two factions were. And it's very much based on Lenin's ideas. The party that he led, of course, was the Social Democrats, and the majority of the Social Democrats very closely followed Lenin's ideas, and they became known as Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks. And Bolsheviks literally just means the majority, and they very closely follow Lenin ideas. Then there's another group of people called the Mensheviks in the Social Democrat Party, and they're known as the minority, and they basically want to kind of, allow capitalism to maybe flourish a little bit, see what happens with the proletariat, maybe have a little bit more democratic type system or whatever. But remember that this party that's in 1903, they have relatively limited ability to do anything because they're very much operating under the guise of an autocratic type government. The Duma is only marginally effective at trying to meet people's goals. So let's take a quick stop here, see if there's any questions. Whoops, click this here. Maximize, refresh. Okay, looks like there's no new questions, so I'm assuming we're all still doing good. Still have 28 viewers. Glad to see it. Let me go ahead. If there's no questions, then I'll just continue. Let's just click this here real fast. Oh, there was one little question here. Did other countries condemn Russians' actions on Bloody Sunday, or did they not care? Generally, they didn't care. There were probably I mean, that's a really good question, actually. There isn't as much of a fear now by the time that Bloody Sunday happens in 1905. If you think about where Britain, France, and Germany are, they don't care about. They're so far past the idea of conservative, absolutist type, divine right things that they're not concerned about revolution happening in their countries because they've established a number of reforms in their countries to prevent things like that from happening. So not really. I don't think that they were very concerned at all. Keep in mind too, at this time, you know, in some ways Europe's a much bigger place at this time because they don't have, you know, Russia's a long way away from the other side of Europe, and so I don't think that they're too concerned about those types of things spreading. Okay, let's go back to, I'm just going to really quick one more time just check real fast because I'm on about a 30-second delay here. Okay, so I know this sounds like it's going slow, but we're a lot farther along than you think that we are. So let's go back to this. All right. Fast forward a little bit. So we were just talking about, you know, the ruler Tsar Nicholas II and how he established the Duma, which was this kind of marginally effective representative body that was more or less still controlled by the Tsar, who had ultimate veto power, and so on. And we also talked about, just a moment ago, Vladimir Lenin, the revolutionary thinker who was a strong Marxist who took Marx and made his own ideas out of it, and how he was the leader of the Social Democrat Workers' Party, and there were two parts of that party, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And basically, in light of the 1905 revolution, which is also known as Bloody Sunday, which we just talked about a moment ago, the Bolsheviks in exile planned a revolution in Russia. There's a guy, Lenin's best buddy is a guy by the name of Leon Trotsky. We'll talk about Trotsky in a minute here. And they formed these workers' soviets. Now, what is a Soviet? We'll talk about that in just a second. But let's fast forward a little bit. Let's talk about what happens in World War I a little bit. So there's this thing that happens called the February Revolution. Remember that Russia is fighting. Russia is allied with Britain and France during this time, fighting against the Central Powers in Europe. Well, things start going very poorly back at home in Russia because Russia is losing like 10 times as many people as anyone else in World War I. And when the Russian troops are dying in tremendous numbers, this kind of, you know, similar, it restokes the fuel of the fire of people's discontent that everybody felt back in 1905 when Bloody Sunday happened in response to losing the Russo-Japanese War. So the most important cause of the February Revolution, sometimes they call it the March Revolution. It kind of happens at the end of February, beginning of March. February Revolution 1917, the most important cause is the tremendous human and economic toll on Russia during World War I. There were massive, massive military casualties. There are food shortages. The Russians are constantly short on supplies, meaning their troops don't have blankets, their troops don't have ammunition, their troops don't have even something as simple as food. And the Tsar's leadership during the war, World War I, was seen as increasingly incompetent. And so the Tsar is off trying to kind of help to, the Tsar is trying to, he's off on the front lines, not quite the front lines, but he's trying to bolster the troops' spirit. And while he's away, he leaves basically the scariest man possible in charge, a guy by the name of Rasputin. And we're going to talk about Rasputin here in a little bit. Rasputin's a pretty scary guy. Let's get to, here's Rasputin for you. As you can tell, he looks like a serial killer. He has those really like creepy eyes, a really long kind of greasy hair, and that scraggly beard. And here's the thing about Rasputin, quick backstory. He was supposed to be kind of a special healer or mystic with powers. And he was famous for quote unquote using hypnosis, manipulating people. He was extremely charismatic, and he basically got all of his own friends in power while the Tsar is away trying to bolster the troops' spirit in World War I. He is absolutely loathed by the Russian people. Now, you might ask yourself, how did such a scary guy become friends with the Tsar in the first place? Well, the answer is that he went to visit the Tsar actually once because of a name dispute. His last name, his name kept on getting mixed up with another like Russian noble's name, and so he goes to like speak to a group of people near to the Tsar about these confusions, if I remember right. This has been a while since I've read into this. But anyway, here's what happens is the Tsar's son, Tsar Nicholas II's son, Alexei, I think his name was a hemophiliac. He had a blood problem where his blood didn't clot. So when he bled, his blood didn't stop. His blood didn't clot, so he kept on bleeding. And so the Tsar's son, who was his only son, was really sick. And Rasputin says, "Oh, you've got a sick son. Oh, well, it turns out that I'm actually a healer. I can help heal him." And being kind of desperate or whatever, Nicholas II agrees to have Rasputin see his son. That would be, like, to me, a really bad idea, but whatever. So he agrees to have him see his son. Well, wouldn't you know it, he ends up getting better and becomes very close, a close personal confidant of the Tsar Nicholas II. And when the Tsar leaves, imagine that conversation, right? Like, imagine that conversation. Like, the whole family's familiar with Rasputin, the scariest looking guy on the planet, but really charismatic and manipulative. And it's like, okay, honey, honey and the kids, he's got 4 daughters, 1 son. Hey, honey, I'm leaving for a while, but guess what? We're going to leave Uncle Rasputin in charge. The kids are like, no, right? Like, don't leave, please, not with him. But anyway, so they leave Rasputin in charge, and eventually nobles conspire to kill Rasputin. But there's a whole other story that goes into that I could seriously sit here and spend like a half hour telling, but I'm not going to. But it's really cool and it's interesting because the whole, like, he was this guy that like was really weird, right? Rasputin was, and he's like, he basically convinces people that he has magical powers and that he can't be killed. And so like they try poisoning him, and he eats enough like cyanide to put down a whale, and he doesn't die. And so ends up, then he gets shot, but he doesn't die from that. And then he escapes, and then he gets shot again, and then they roll him up in a carpet and throw him into a river in the middle of January. Anyway, or December, middle of winter sometime in Russia, which is pretty cold to be thrown into a river. Anyway, there was this whole story about it, but I won't get into it. The legend behind Rasputin is quite interesting. Anyhow, getting back to the story here, they leave Rasputin in charge. Rasputin he does get assassinated eventually. You can read more about Rasputin. There's a lot of things that I'm leaving out. Trust me, kids. He's a bizarre figure in history, but I look him up. Okay, Rasputin. Read about him. There's some weird things that go on there. But anyway, let's get back to this here. Double check, make sure that we're not missing out on any questions here. Okay, so does Rasputin actually do anything during this time? Yeah, he does do things at this time. He puts a lot of his friends into power, friends and family members he puts into power, and of course the Russian nobility doesn't like that because they see themselves as having the authority to make decisions. Samir made a comment. Didn't the February Revolution, didn't it occur in March because the Russians were still using the outdated Gregorian calendar, which by then had lost a month when compared to the... Yes, that is correct. That's the reason why it happens kind of Yeah. Yes, that's the answer. Okay, so sometimes you'll hear people say the February Revolution, other times you'll hear people say the March Revolution. Sometimes you'll hear them say the October Revolution, other times you'll hear them say the November Revolution. It just depends on which calendar that you're talking about. Also, weren't Rasputin and the Tsarina involved in an affair? It wouldn't surprise me. I'm leaving, like I said, a lot of stuff out about Rasputin. You can read that on your own time. I'm not getting into that. I'm not going to touch that issue here. So let's go back to the thing here. That's Rasputin, and we're going back to now. Let's talk about what Soviets are. Okay, real quick. Soviets are basically these elected councils in Russia. They're very similar in some ways to the Zemstos. They're kind of a new age Zemstos, and basically Lenin and Leon Trotsky start forming these workers' soviets, these council of workers, soldiers, and intellectuals. And what these soviets are supposed to do is to offer the oppressed workers an opportunity to participate in a very localized, direct democracy. And so these soviets are these kind of councils that start popping up, if you will, all over Russia, particularly Western Russia. Now, the largest Soviet is the Soviet that's centered in St. Petersburg, which at this time is also known as Petrograd. And the revolution was started basically by massive strikes in January and February caused by food shortages, 1917, World War I, and once again, what other reason than are people going to riot because of a shortage of bread? How many times have we talked about bread shortages causing riots? Notably, women rioted for bread in Petrograd, and they were supported by the Petrograd Soviet at this time, where thousands of soldiers who had been ordered to suppress the strikes now actually gave their support to the revolution. So we see a mutiny take place in the urban kind of workers in Petrograd, the largest, Soviet, who are now giving their support to the revolution thanks to the fact that there's this food shortage going on. So what ends up happening? Well, in 1917, Nicholas is forced to abdicate the throne, and that ends the Romanov dynasty, and that is known as the February Revolution or the March Revolution, depending on how you which calendar you're using, as Samir brought up just a minute ago. So this is a little bit more about Lenin. I'm kind of all over the place here. I apologize for that. Let's talk a little bit more about Lenin. So Nicholas II abdicates the throne. What does that mean? That means he steps down. That happens on March 2nd, and the royal family is placed under house arrest at this time. Only about 1,000 Russians actually ended up dying in the March Revolution, and the Duma responds. Remember the Duma, which was the representative body that was supposed to be somewhat representative, by declaring a provisional government. Now, this provisional government is basically a dual government that rules Russia during this time. And the provisional government consists of constitutional Democrats and liberals, many of whom wanted to continue the war, and then the Petrograd Soviet, which consisted of workers and soldiers who had overthrown the Tsars, and the soldiers now controlled the army. So these two bodies, the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet, are kind of dual ruling Russia at this time during the provisional government era, where there is no longer a Tsar in charge. And the guy that ends up becoming the leader of the Petrograd Soviet, of course, is Vladimir Lenin. And the guy that ends up becoming the leader of the provisional government is Alexander Kerensky. I'm sorry, I misspoke. When I said that the guy that became the leader of the Petrograd Soviet, Vladimir Lenin was the leader of the Social Democratic Party. But the Social Democratic Party, remember, split into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And the Mensheviks led the organization of the Petrograd Soviet. basically the Petrograd Soviet accepted the authority of the provisional government because it saw it as the best chance for maintaining control of the country. And eventually the Soviet brought together representatives from other Soviets around Russia, and they kind of emerged as a national body of more radical ideas and reforms and so on. Alexander Kerensky is the guy that Vladimir Lenin views as his political opponent. So Alexander Kerensky is the leader of this entire provisional government, and he's still technically a member of the Soviet at this time. Participation of Kerensky and other Soviets in the new coalition government gave the provisional government more legitimacy, and they started implementing kind of liberal programs like westernized ideas of 8-hour workdays, election officials, amnesty of political prisoners, right of unions to organize and strike, A lot of freedom of religion, speech, and assembly, a lot of Western ideas that they're trying to implement under the provisional government. But remember, if it's provisional, that means that just like a provisional driver's license, it means it's temporary. So they're figuring out a pathway to a more permanent government after the Tsar steps down in the February Revolution of 1917. There was a thing called Army Order Number 1 on March 1st, 1917, and that was when it was issued by the Petrograd Soviet, seeking to replace military officers who were loyal to the Tsar and place the Soviet in the firm control of the army, and that ends up being very much the case. All right, so a few months go by, and at this time, Russia is still in World War I, but things are going very, very poorly. And so questions start to surround like, well, what's the future of Russia's government going to look like during this provisional government phase? Well, and we've talked about Lenin here. Basically, Lenin eventually transfers legal authority to the Soviets, and Lenin himself is extremely opposed to World War I. And during this provisional government phase, after the Tsar steps down, Vladimir Lenin is trying to, very deliberately put himself into a position where he is going to be able to carry out his own view of kind of a Marxist type proletariat revolt. And the way that he goes about doing that is by issuing something called, we talked about this, Lenin was the head of the Bolshevik party, the most radical communist supporters. The Bolsheviks used World War I, Russia's hungry population, and the inequalities of workers to gain more support. And eventually the Bolsheviks end up gaining control of the entire Petrograd Soviet, which is important because when the Bolsheviks take over, that means that he is now in direct opposition to Kerensky's provisional government. So we start to see a power struggle take place, and he is gaining more and more and more support. Well, there is ultimately something called the October Revolution that breaks out. And the October Revolution came on, basically it's resulted in the communist dictatorship and the rise of Vladimir Lenin to power. So there was, the Bolsheviks end up storming the Winter Palace in Russia, and they seized the control of the provisional government in a non-violent revolution. Now, I want to remind you that the Russian Revolution is not a revolution like the French Revolution, where we see a whole bunch of crazy people running around with like their heads getting chopped off and being thrown on pikes and people parading around the streets. By comparison, actually, you might think, oh wow, the Russian Revolution, that one's going to be pretty violent. It was pretty non-violent, actually. Very few people ended up losing their lives in the initial part of the revolution, outside of the 1905 Bloody Sunday thing. But besides that, you really don't see a lot of violence in the Russian Revolution. when Vladimir Lenin comes to power, which is kind of ironic since he kind of said that, you know, the whole proletariat would have to rise up in a violent revolution, but, you know, whatever. Okay, so they seize control of the provisional government. Germany previously had arranged for Lenin to be transported back to Russia in a sealed railroad car in April of 1917. And the reason that the reason that this happened was because, just going back here for a second, there's Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin, if you recall, had been kind of doing all of this stuff remotely because he had been exiled in Switzerland. And so the Germans, with, you know, knowing that he was a major player in getting inciting a revolution, basically are hoping to inject Vladimir Lenin into Russia to start this revolution. And so what they do is they transport him from Switzerland over to Russia, and that was in April 1917, where he issued his April Theses, which was all about calling for this communist revolution, you know, rejecting the bourgeois provisional government that had been in place, led under the leadership of Kerensky, and, you know, nationalizing, which means putting under control of the government the banks, all of the landed estates. And basically, you know, what he assures them in these April Theses, if you remember the term peace, land, and bread, and then also to stop the war. So he's promising them power to the Soviets, land to the Soviets, stop the war now. That was the three promises: peace, land, and bread. And you know, Lenin starts up this overthrow. He starts planning it back as early as April of 1917, and then by the time that we get to, like I said a moment ago, by the time that we get to October, he has in fact taken over the Winter Palace and de-seated Kerensky, because Kerensky had refused to end the war, and basically Kerensky loses all credit with the army, and now we see a new leader of the army, Leon Trotsky, who was the leader of the Petrograd Soviet and the Red Army, and he led the Soviet overthrow and the arrest of the provisional government. So the Bolsheviks end up taking Russia out of the war, all right? And this happens with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918, March 3rd, 1918. They take Russia out of World War I, but this is an important factor in basically the provisions of this treaty caused Russia to lose about a third of its population and about a quarter of its land. And the land that they lost was the western portion, which was the most populous part. They lost territories in the Baltic states, meaning Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, Finland, places like that, if you remember your map quiz. And this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was Lenin coming through on his promise to take Russia out of the war, which of course was going very, very badly for them. Lenin gave direct control of individual factories by local worker committees. He gave land to peasants. These are some of the other reforms that he did. He gave land to peasants, although peasants had really pretty much already taken it by this point. But anyway, and then there was also a new secret police organization started up called the Cheka, the C-H-E-K-A, Cheka, the secret police that was created in December to eliminate any opponents to this portion, the Bolsheviks, the radical communists in support of Vladimir Lenin and his buddy Leon Trotsky, who led the Red Army or the Bolshevik Army. Moving on here, if you take a look at where the Bolsheviks are in terms of Russia, the Mensheviks, You have the moderates, kind of the bourgeoisie or bourgeoisie, and then the Tsarists who would have been loyal to the Tsar. And there are still a few of those around. Remember that the Tsar had been put into kind of exile, and his family had been put into house arrest. So when the Russian Revolution happens, a civil war breaks out. Now, I said a moment ago, hey, don't think of the Russian Revolution as being too violent. That's only the October Revolution side of things. The Russian Revolution results in a civil war that actually is incredibly violent. When he de-seats the provisional government, that's one thing. But then when the war breaks out, that's a completely other. And so the Russian Civil War breaks out from 2 years. Lenin moves the government from St. Petersburg to Moscow during this time. Trotsky completely reorganizes the army to be, the Red Army in full communist support, or Red Army. The Bolsheviks at this time. They weren't called the communists quite yet, but that's basically what they are. And so these actions resulted in a lot of opposition to the Bolsheviks, obviously, and that's why the Civil War breaks out. So Russian Civil War, it was the Reds versus the Whites in the Russian Civil War. The Whites would have included the minority, the Mensheviks, as well as others, officers of the old army, Tsarists, people who wanted liberal reforms but not communism. A lot of peasants feared the Whites and supported the Reds. Both sides were extremely brutal with one another. Of course, the concern about communism taking over Russia is very concerning to Western capitalist states. And so allies sent troops to help the Whites, helping to kind of get Russia back into the war on the Eastern Front. So America, Britain, France are attempting to help out the Whites, the White Army, because they don't want a communist revolution. The communists are anti-Russia involvement in civil war. The Whites would have continued the war, and that's why the Allies in World War I are hoping to get Russia back in the war to continue their fight against Germany. But that ship has sailed, and it does not work. So civil war breaks out. Instituted kind of the Red Terror, as it's called. The secret police killed 200,000 of the Cheka killed 200,000 of Lenin's opponents. July 1918, Bolsheviks execute Nicholas II and his family to prevent them from being manipulated by the Whites. And perhaps, the other thing too about this is getting rid of any legitimacy. So if you execute Nicholas II and his whole family, that means that no one can come about and say, oh, I should be the rightful leader of Russia. So that's why that happens. And here you've got the various members of the Romanov dynasty, Nicholas II, who is the Tsar. The story, of course, about Anastasia is that, maybe she escaped or something. That did not happen. The whole family was brought to a basement and basically executed by way of point blank gunshot to the head. That was the picture that I came. This is Jean-Sébastien Giguère. He was the former goaltender for the Ducks back in 2003. I just think he looks so much like Nicholas II and George V that it's just kind of almost frightening. But anyway, moving on. When the Civil War breaks out, we've only got about a half hour left here, so I appreciate you guys sticking with me through all of this. I'm going to take a quick break, see if we got any new questions. All right. Okay, whoa. Did Britain under George V try to get the Romanovs out of Russia since they were all related and all that? I don't know. I'm not really entirely sure on that. You would have, I'm sorry, I'm just looking, sorry, hopefully it's not too scratchy. I don't know if anyone can tell me if it's still scratchy or not. Can Can you guys see me? Hopefully it's slightly better quality. There's a delay, so I got to wait for you guys' responses. Hopefully you guys can see me okay. Anyway, the question that Samir just asked about Britain under George V trying to get the Romanovs out, I don't think that they did. Maybe they did. I don't know. You know, him and Wilhelm II, they were all like, you know, cousins, right? So, but they were at the same time, they were like at war with one another. So I don't know. You could probably read a book about that. I think there is a book actually about like the nature of their relationship. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Well, hopefully you guys can all see me, and it's not too scratchy and you guys can understand what I'm saying. Let's double check, make sure there's no new questions over here. Nope, no new ones over there. Okay, we're good to go. Refresh this real fast. Uh-oh. Okay, scratchiness. Okay, scratchiness is good. Thanks, guys. Sorry, I just saw that now. Okay, it's all good. It's by the way, on a scale of 0 to French Revolution, how bad was this communist revolution? We'll go full-blown French. Although, you know, the thing is, it actually ironically kind of results in a little bit more stable government, but stability at the cost of basically brutal oppression of the people and the deaths of like countless people. So the Russian Revolution is maybe you might say a little bit more I don't know, it's bad. It's not like it's good. It's still very bad. It still results in the deaths of many people, but it results in like a little bit more longer lasting predictable government rather than iteration after iteration after iteration of government like in the French Revolution. So stable, but stable at the cost of like brutal dictatorship oppression. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint here. I'm going to refresh. Very good, Samir. Yes, I agree. Okay, let's see here. Screen share. All right, we're going to close this out here in the next little section. So stick with me here to the end. We're almost done. Go back to this, and then we'll go to this. Okay, all right. Now, during the Civil War, the Russian Civil War lasts from 1918 to 1920, and like I said before, it's between the Reds and the Whites. Now, during this time, basically over 2 million people left Russia due to the revolution and the Civil War. And one of the things that's instituted is something called war communism. Now, during the Civil War, the Bolsheviks began this really klutzy, disorganized, like war communism plan that attempted to basically, it's the earliest form of communism in the Soviet Union. It takes this kind of total war idea that we're going to be talking about with World War I, where you devote all sectors of your economy to the war. And it's basically a total war concept as applied to the Russian Civil War. They declare all land national property, so there's no such thing as private property anymore. The Russian state takes control of all heavy industries. They end private trade. Private trade is completely abolished. religious property becomes government owned. All banks, industry, privately held commercial property are now government owned and operated. Now think about this for just 2 seconds, guys. The reason that private businesses work well is because they compete with one another. They're forced to innovate. They're forced to sell the best products for the best price. Demand and supply are regulated somewhat naturally in a free market. And when you let banks or industries or companies or whatever run themselves, as it turns out, actually the people who are running them know what they're doing. They have a good idea of how to run the business. They know how to cope with the stresses of keeping up with demand. They know how to make the goods. They know how to sell the goods. They know how to market the goods. And when you take all of that away and you decide to try to like make it run by the state, it turns into basically a giant mess. It's kind of like leaving, like it would be like, imagine if magically all stores that sold clothes in the United States just closed. Imagine if all stores that sold clothes automatically were like shut down, and then now all clothing administration was going to be run by the government. It's like the government doesn't know how to make clothes. It's like you put some government official into a clothes factory, and it's like he has no idea what he's doing there, right? So this plan of war communism backfires big time. The Cheka during this time are hunting down and executing thousands of opponents to the war communism plan, and that includes, like I mentioned a moment ago, the Tsar and his family. The Cheka was the secret police, just to remind you. And by basically this war communist plan, let's talk about some of the effects of it. By 1920, so this is the Civil War lasts from 1918 to 1920. By 1920, the result of war communism is that industrial production falls 90%, 90% from what it was before. Agricultural output was down 50%. Workers are starting to go on strike. By the time that 1920 comes around, the peasants are like, did we support the right guy? The workers are like, did we support the right guy as well? Like, what's the deal here? I thought we were going to get peace, land, and bread. The only thing that we've gotten is none of it. Well, we got land, I guess. They got land. They really didn't get peace because although they got brought out of World War I, immediately the Russian Civil War broke out, and then they didn't get bread because industrial and agricultural output went down so much during war communism because people didn't know what they were doing when they were running it. So by 1921, the Russian Civil War ends, and the Red Army is victorious. That Leon Trotsky had led the Red Army. By the way, these were this was a propaganda poster, the 1920 Bolshevik poster entitled "The Last Battle" shows a Red Army soldier, bashing down a capitalist British or American businessman off of the world. And then I think I had some other. Yeah, this is another one. This is a Bolshevik poster. This is Uncle Sam. This is America. This is an anti-America, anti-white army propaganda poster that has the 3 major white army leaders on leash of the Western powers, and of course that's going to make people anti-white army because they think that they're the foreign control and stuff like that. So the Civil War, 10 million people are estimated to have died in the Russian Civil War. The Red Army is victorious, despite the fact that Britain, France, Japan, and the U.S. all sent in troops and supplies to try to aid the White Army, but they are defeated in 1920. And then moving forward, basically the costs of the revolution, like I said, 10 to 15 million people dead, rough estimates there. The economy is completely ruined. The international trade is basically down. Millions of workers had fled the country or had been starting to strike because they're freaking out. It's pretty bad. And at that time, that's when Lenin institutes what's known as his new economic policy. Now, this new economic policy was basically a realization by Lenin that war communism had been a giant mess. And so he radically reverses war communism in an effort to appeal to the people by instituting the new economic policy, or the NEP, in 1921. He temporarily even restores some elements of capitalism and private enterprise. I mean, that's how much the initial attempt at communism in Russia failed, is that that Lenin literally goes back on his idea and realizes, like, in order to win the workers' support, I need to keep them happy. I need to reinstitute some elements of private enterprise. And then he dies. So Lenin dies in 1924. Any time that you try and institute a radical change like the NEP from war communism during this time where Russia's in a giant mess post-Civil War, it's going to take a few years before it gets off the ground. And so Lenin dies in 1924 under somewhat curious circumstances. He may have died naturally, but there may have been other causes there, as in, like, you know, Stalin or something. But a struggle to take power in Russia begins, and the natural successor to Lenin would have been Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was, again, the leader of the Red Army, but you know what? He doesn't end up taking power. It ends up being Joseph Stalin, who becomes the new leader of Russia in 1928. Basically, Joseph Stalin uses some very clever political techniques to kind of harness his power in the 4-year period of confusion of who's the leader of Russia post-Leninist Russia. And Lenin dies, and that's his embalmed body, actually, which is still on display to this day, although they just recently had to kind of primp him up recently, because over time his embalmed body had started to flatten. And so it's a little bit weird, but that's him there. They embalmed him as a great leader of Russia, overthrowing the Tsar, and so on. I'm going to go back here to me, and let's see if we have any new questions, because I'm pretty much right here at the end now. What were the main differences between Marxism and Leninism? Just to remind you, Marxism and Leninism are more or less the same thing, except for Lenin. The biggest difference is that Lenin said that you needed an organized and disciplined party with an organized and disciplined leader of that party, him, in order to get the revolution off the ground. But the other thing that he said is that you don't need the entire proletariat to gain consciousness, that as long as you have a disciplined party, you can teach them, you can lead the revolution for them on behalf of the people, and still establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. So anyway, those would be the main differences. And then, of course, the other major difference between Lenin and other Marxists of Lenin's time, the Marxists of Lenin's time were all revisionist Marxists who thought that you could basically keep the government in place and make reforms that benefited the worker, and not have a violent uprising that de-seated the entire government. So those would be the major differences. Let me double check here, refresh, see if we've got any other comments. All right, well, I have a list of people who are here right now. And so I will screenshot this and make sure to give you guys a couple of points for joining me on this this afternoon, evening lecture on the Russian Revolution. Are there any questions at this time before I sign off here? We have 30 viewers in here. You guys are awesome. You stuck it through. I really appreciate it. I hope that this was informative for you. I went over a lot. Okay, I mean, we covered, like, this would take me 2 weeks to cover in a regular history class. So I mean, if you guys are at all confused, I understand. You may need to go back, look things over again, but hopefully my explaining this to you. The thing about the Russian Revolution that's a little tricky is that there's multiple revolutions. In fact, let's just take a second to review some of these things that we talked about today. Okay, there were basically 3 stages of the Russian Revolution. The first one, you might say, goes all the way back to 1905. All right, 1905 is with Bloody Sunday. That was the first time that we saw a revolt in Russia. That resulted in the establishment of the Duma. The Duma was that government that was supposed to operate on behalf of the people, but ends up having, being, subject to the Tsar's veto power, so it doesn't have any real influence, and gets dissolved twice within the first year. The Duma doesn't end up really having a whole lot of influence in that period of time from about 1906 to about 1917. It's around. There are parties to it, but it's not, the Tsar remains really in complete autocratic control of Russia during that time. Russia then enters World War I. That's when we move into the second part of the Russian Revolution. That one was the March Revolution. That's the one where the Tsar abdicates the throne because the war is going so badly at that time. There's so many people dying, and people are hungry, and it's bad. So the March Revolution, or the February/March Revolution, was when Rasputin was in power, and people are freaking out about that, and then there's strikes in St. Petersburg, aka Petrograd, and so on. So that's when Nicholas abdicates the throne. Okay, that's when the provisional government is put into place. Provisional government meaning temporary government. It was always meant to be temporary. The provisional government was led by Alexander Kerensky. Kerensky ends up emerging as kind of being viewed as incompetent because he doesn't want to end Russia's involvement in the war. Meanwhile, during that provisional government phase is when Lenin gets kind of transported back into Russia to purposefully ignite this discontent that's happening in Russia. His April theses, 1917, peace, land, bread, want to make sure to achieve those goals. Follow me, I can lead us to that. And then over that period of time from April until the October Revolution, which is the third one, that's when Vladimir Lenin takes over the Winter Palace, and a new communist government is basically put into place. That happens in October of 1917, October/November, and depending on the calendar you're using. And shortly thereafter, from 1918 to 1920, is when the Civil War breaks out between the Red Army and the White Army. The Red Army led by BFF of Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky. And Leon Trotsky emerges as victorious, but during that time they had that whole issue with war communism, which actually put Russia in a really economically fragile place. That's why Lenin wants to institute the NEP, the new economic policy, to reestablish certain capitalist elements into their economy. That never ends up taking off because Vladimir Lenin dies in 1924. So hopefully that was a nice little review of everything that we talked about. Let me go back, see if there's any last comments here. Adam Jockson, I'm about to fight Paul on War Thunder. What plane should I use? Focke-Wulf 190. That's the best one, in my opinion. When did World War I actually end? It ends in 1918, June 28th, 1918. Almost like, or no. 11th hour, 11th day, 11th month. It ends in 1918. Thanks, Alyssa. You're awesome. Thank you for watching. Appreciate that. Any other questions? Well, I'm going to close it down at this time. Yes, World War I lasted until, what I was thinking was they negotiate, so it ends Remembrance Day. Our Veterans Day is the day that World War I ends. November 11th is called Remembrance Day in Britain. They 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month is when World War I ends. But what I was thinking, the reason I said June 28th is because June 28th, 1919 is when they negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, and that's when it designates the exact day they did it on the 5-year anniversary of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's death. So that's why I got that date confused for a second there. But anyway, all right, guys. Well, I'm going to close it down here. Seeing as there's no other new questions, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope this has been helpful for you. Come back on Tuesday where we will continue talking about World War I. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye.